Thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks everyone too for coming early. I noticed a lot of people came early so they could take the back seats, and then I worked, so it's worked its way towards the front. I'm Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. I'm happy to welcome you here to Ream Library this afternoon to Holy Cross, and I'm pleased that you're here to join what I think will be a really exciting conversation for the next 2 days on Francis the Pilgrim, from personal devotion to papal diplomacy. It's an opportunity to look at the person and priorities of a really remarkable man, Pope Francis, through some very specific lenses. In the discussions that follow, we'll try to learn more about the man by examining his devotional life, the travels he's undertaken, and the symbols he's surrounded himself with. A great deal of attention has been given, quite rightly, to who Pope Francis surrounds himself with, washing the feet of prisoners, who he goes and who he's among. But I think we can also get and look at where he's prioritized to go and what symbols and devotions are most meaningful to him in his life. Maybe an anecdote to start us off. I'm told there are a couple versions of this story. My version comes from Cardinal Tobin, who told it to me a month or two ago. He's a much better storyteller than I am, but here goes. We'll stay with it. Very shortly after his election to the papacy, the man known until a few days before as Jorge Mario Bergoglio met with Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, then the Vatican Secretary of State. And it's logical that that would be an important meeting early on. No doubt Bertone wanted to do a good job as the kind of person who was going to orient his new employee into the Vatican. That wasn't Cardinal Tobin's words, but it was a way of sort of setting things in. And Pope Francis told Bertone early on that he wanted to go to Lampedusa, the barren island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea that's become a destination and a holding pen for African migrant asylum seekers who had survived boat rides that far. To many Europeans, Lampedusa symbolized the threat that people who must be held back, the threatening hordes of others who were going to take over Europe itself. Bertone, a seasoned diplomat, as Tobin recounts it, he didn't see quite a visit there as a promising start, so he tried to talk Pope Francis out of it quite gently and to say that tactfully that there were certain other important visits that perhaps he ought to do first, places he ought to see that would signal the priorities of the Holy See. And apparently he left imagining that he'd convinced Pope Francis otherwise. The next week when they met, the Pope came in, he told him, he said, "I want to go to Lampedusa." And the realistic diplomat, Bertone, tried to buy time. He said, certainly we could do this. It'll take 6 months or a year. There are security arrangements. There are travel arrangements. Don't worry. We'll put it in place. We'll take care of it. Don't worry. A week passed and nothing happened. And Bertone apparently picked up the telephone from someone. It was the vice chairman of Alitalia, the Italian airline, who, as a courtesy call, just wanted them to know that a certain Jorge Mario Bergoglio had himself booked a single ticket to Lampedusa for the next week and would be going there. Clearly, Bertone knew what he was up against. And Lampedusa, as many of you may know, was in fact the first papal trip, even before the famous trip to Brazil, where he had his car take him into the slums and the like. Among the lessons we can take from this, of course, is that Pope Francis doesn't just passively take trips to wherever he's told by the Vatican Vatican diplomats. His trips are really meant to signal something about himself and about his priorities. At this point, 5 years into his papacy, many of us like to think that we have a sense of who Pope Francis is. I've read about him, followed him diligently, and I've always been profoundly thankful and grateful for him, despite a few puzzling moments when I wished he'd get something better than he seemed to. And after I had written this at 2 o'clock this afternoon, he went about and corrected one of those things that I thought he didn't quite get, and he turned around, so he's correcting me yet again. He has lots of surprises. Last night I was able to sit down and read the bulk of his newly issued exhortation, Gaudete et Exultate, Rejoice and Be Glad. And that document too reminded me yet again that if I think I know Pope Francis, he still has plenty more surprises in store, that he won't be easily categorized, and he won't be, because of that, he won't be too easily dismissed. He has challenges and a lot of insights to share. Fortunately for us, we have some people here who are with us who know him well and can articulate, can tell us a lot more about who he is because of their own experiences, and I'm looking forward to that. Before I introduce Austen Ivereigh, I want to mention Tom Rees, SJ, the senior analyst at the Religion News Service and the former editor-in-chief of the Jesuit weekly Catholic magazine America. Inés San Martin, who is an Argentinian journalist who covers the Vatican and Rome and has had a big role in the Brazilian visit that I mentioned. Elise Harris, a senior correspondent covering the Vatican for Catholic News Agency and EWTN in Rome. Father Rogers will be introducing them all. And again, before I introduce, one last thing, before I introduce Austen Ivereigh, I do want to thank Father Mike Rogers, SJ, a member of the class of 2002, who's been back at Holy Cross. It's his work conceptualizing and organizing the conference. He's done the work to make it happen, and I'm really grateful to that. In addition to his work as a chaplain on campus, Father Rogers has been a fellow at the McFarland Center for almost 2 years. He's given a great deal back to Holy Cross in the time that he's been here. And I think this event is a great way of capping off his work here before he heads to the University of Toronto for doctoral studies. I want to thank Pat Hinchliffe and Danielle Kane for their work to make it happen. And finally, to acknowledge the generous support of two Holy Cross alum families, the Deichmann family and the Ream family, whose gifts through the Deichmann Family Foundation, the Deichmann Lectures, and the Ream Family Fund have made it possible for us to be here. We opened the conference with a great authority on the life of Pope Francis, Austen Ivereigh. A British writer, journalist, and commentator, Dr. Ivereigh is author of the biography, The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope, published in 2014. The book explores how the political milieu of Argentina and his Jesuit training shaped Jorge Mario Bergoglio, his beliefs, and his papacy. It's an exceptionally insightful book, one that I was mentioning I read on the way on a trip to Argentina that really helped me think about that trip and the work that I was doing there quite differently. It's one that I really appreciated. Austen Ivereigh regularly contributes to American Magazine, The Tablet, Crux, and other sources. He's been deputy editor of The Tablet, the British Catholic weekly, was press secretary to the Archbishop of Westminster. He's the co-founder of Catholic Voices, a communications project now in 20 countries, and authored another book, How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice, in 2012. He holds a PhD from Oxford University, where he first wrote about Catholicism and politics in Argentina for his dissertation. His talk today is titled, God Made the First Move, Mercy in the Life and Papacy of Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Following the talk, I'll invite Religious Studies Professor Mary Roach to make some response, and then we'll have a discussion after that. So please join me in welcoming Austen Ivereigh.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you all for that lovely welcome. I want to begin with a quote from Pope Francis in Asunción, Paraguay, in July 2015. How many times do we see evangelization as involving any number of strategies, tactics, maneuvers, and techniques, as if we could convert people on the basis of our own arguments? Today, the Lord says to us quite clearly, in the mentality of the gospel, you do not convince people with arguments, strategies, or tactics. You convince them simply by learning how to welcome them, how much pain can be soothed, how much despair can be allayed in a place where we feel at home. It's a wonderful quote, and I wanted to begin with it because I felt very much at home here these last couple of days in Holy Cross. I've enormously appreciated the great welcome I've had from the Jesuits, particularly Father Mike, who's organized this. It's been really a terrific couple of days. I've enjoyed meeting many of the students. I've given a couple of classes. I've been really struck by this place's passion for truth, for the gospel, for that great Jesuit humanist tradition. And I've been struck really by the kind of calm and the warmth of the place, which I think, and I'm no great Ignatian spiritual expert, but I think is a sign of consolation, a sign of the Holy Spirit. Clearly around here, God has made the first move. Now, I want to talk today about the central, massive, overarching theme of mercy in the life of Pope Francis and in this pontificate. It seems like rather an obvious topic with which to begin this conference, but also a slightly overwhelming one because it is just so huge theologically, ecclesiologically, and everything else. So I want to lock this down in a very focused way and ask simply, what is Francis up to when he keeps banging on about mercy? In other words, what is his plan, his vision for the church by focusing on mercy? What is this about? What's really going on? And I think it's fundamental because actually I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, we're concerned with narratives. And there are two meta-narratives about this papacy which seem to me quite wrong. One is what one might call, and forgive the terms, a liberal or a conservative one. On the one hand, there's this idea that by talking so much about mercy, it's somehow an old-fashioned, pietistic idea. There's an assumption there about what's true and so on. In other words, there's a nervousness that this involves too much a kind of hierarchical relationship between God and man and so on. On the other side, this emphasis on mercy strikes certain conservatives as a way of diluting the truth. They're suspicious that behind this emphasis on mercy lurks a kind of accommodation with modernity. And you can see this in a recent book by Ross Douthat called To Change the Church, which is really arguing that Francis is a kind of assimilationist and he's watering down the solid truth. I think both of these understandings are deeply wrong, deeply false, and I want to persuade you today that the way to understand what Francis is trying to do to the church is precisely by understanding what mercy is really about. Now you see in a way this polarization, this misunderstanding during the two family synods, October 2014, October 2015, which led to Amoris Laetitia in April 2016. You can see how there was a polarization around the question of should we or should we not allow the divorced and remarried to be readmitted to the sacraments. And there was on the one hand no, and on the other hand yes. And actually Francis very patiently throughout it all was trying to say it's not like that. It's not simply yes or no. It is about coming close, being close and being concrete to people in their specific circumstances. And so you can see that even in the heart of the church, the very bishops are struggling in a way with the hermeneutic of mercy, which Pope Francis is inviting us to. So I don't pretend that this is an easy topic. When Francis talks about pastoral conversion, which is, if you like, the great phrase which underpins his desire for reform, that we actually, behind this lurks this theology of mercy, which isn't always easy to understand. So here's how I want to do it with you in the next 45 minutes or so. I want to break up this talk into three parts, which is something Francis always does, point 1, point 2, point 3. I want to talk briefly about the role that mercy played in his own conversion, his own commitment to a vocation, which led finally into the Society of Jesus. So what happened to him when he was 16, nearly 17 in a basilica, and I know more about this now since I wrote the biography. Secondly, I want to talk about the Latin American church's focus on mercy as a response to globalized technocracy. There we go. I know you were waiting for some nice big words. Globalized technocracy is going to be the second part. How Francis's signs of the times discernment led him to believe that this is how the church must, as it were, evangelize and respond to these times. And then lastly, I want to end with how a few stresses in this pontificate, particularly in the Jubilee of Mercy, how he's carrying out that mercy-based reform. I know I speak in a strange accent and strange version of your language, and if you have any trouble understanding me, just wave your hands. I can sometimes speak a little bit quickly as well, but let me know. But let's go to that basilica in October 1953. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, tall, lanky teenager, aged nearly 17. He's on his way to meet his friends. He has a girlfriend, and on the way to meet her, he suddenly decides to go into the basilica. He sees in the corner the open door of a confessional. He goes in, he confesses. We don't know what he confesses, but what we do know is this. Whatever happened in that confessional, that experience overwhelmed him. He describes it as like being thrown from a horse. His life thereafter would never be the same. And when he talks about this, he uses the phrase in Spanish, Dios nos primerea. God gets in there first. God anticipates us. A central theme of his understanding of how God works in our lives is that it's God who takes the initiative. That's what happened. This was completely unexpected, unmerited. He wasn't looking for it. It happened to him. After coming out of the confessional, he spent some time talking about the experience with the priest who confessed him, who was called Father Duarte Ibarra, who was a priest he didn't know. That was his church, but he didn't know the priest. Turns out the priest had leukemia, cancer of the blood, and a year later died. But over that year, nurtured the young Bergoglio in what is effectively spiritual discerning, trying to understand what God was doing in his life. And that led him then to make the commitment. Over time, it wasn't simple to become a priest. But what happened was that Ibarra died suddenly, I think, unexpectedly anyway. The treatment didn't work. And Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who hadn't spoken about this to anybody, who had confided in this priest, was left absolutely devastated. But then he says, and he told this to Andrea Tornielli in 2016, then he said he really experienced the mercy of God in a very profound way. And it's interesting, isn't it? There's this kind of death and rebirth and feeling the mercy of God, experiencing the mercy of God, just at the moment when he felt sort of most bereft. He always talks about his life. He reads his life, he says, in light of chapter 16 of Ezekiel. He says, it's as if there everything is written just for me. And now chapter 16 of Ezekiel is the dramatic story of the relationship between Israel and God and Yahweh, but told through a kind of metaphor of a husband and a wife. So a wife who is cared for, a baby left in the ground to die is rescued, nurtured, fed, clothed, covered in fine jewels, becomes a beautiful woman, desired by everybody, but then becomes self-infatuated, falls, prostitutes herself, and her husband, the man, Yahweh in this case, who should be angry, she should rightly be stoned, in fact decides to win her back by what? By mercy. He seeks to persuade her back by loving her unconditionally, by forgiving her. And that passage, which I'll leave you to look up, but it ends with precisely saying, I will care for you, I will love you, I will win you back, and in your confusion you will be reduced to silence when I have pardoned you for all you have done. It is the Lord who speaks. And reflecting on that, Bergoglio says the shame there that he experiences is a positive shame. It's the shame that allows God in, that allows us to be loved. So there's much to be said about that experience, but this, of course, is what led him not just to be a priest, but also to understand how God works in people's lives. And underpinning that experience was a kind of three-stage dynamic, which I want to argue is fundamental for understanding not just mercy, but how Francis believes the church needs to present the gospel to the world. And there are many different ways of describing this three-stage suffering, but I'll just begin by saying it begins with a sensing of need, an attentiveness to anguish and suffering. So the first thing is we see somebody in pain, or somebody is in pain, and there's a reaching out. That's what I mean about taking the initiative. So God takes the initiative to reach out to us in our anguish and our suffering. But of course, this we can also do to other people. Secondly, there's this concrete response, a response in the form of the works of mercy, but in a spiritual sense, a response of accompaniment. So you walk with that person, and in a very Ignatian sense, discernment as well. So that growth in holiness happens, growth towards God in our relationship with God happens over time in that process of accompaniment. And then there's the third phase, which is integration, bringing in from the outside, turning the stranger into somebody who belongs. And it's this third stage of integration where the big conflict in this papacy lies, as it always does with integration. Integration, to some extent, always scandalizes, or it should scandalize, because there's a sense of threat. In bringing somebody in, you feel sometimes that your identity is questioned. So I want to argue that that three-stage dynamic is crucial to understanding how he wants the church to be, and it's what underpinned the Jubilee of Mercy. So he's a young man, he becomes a Jesuit, as we know, and at the heart of the Ignatian spiritual exercises, of course, is precisely this conversion through mercy. The first week is all about experiencing the mercy of God, knowing we're unconditionally loved, and then our response to that is then to choose to follow Christ. So again, it begins with the sense of being, with the understanding of being forgiven, and then our response. So at the heart of this is not we don't become holy, we don't become Christian through our own effort exactly. It's not something we achieve, but rather it's about our response to his unconditional love. And that, of course, is the subject of the document which Tom mentioned that came out on Monday, Rejoice and Be Glad, is precisely about the way grace works in our life. So mercy and grace are very, very closely connected, as they are in the spiritual exercises. But also think about that exercise early on in the spiritual exercises on the 30-day retreat, where Ignatius describes the Holy Trinity, God looking down on earth, and everybody's going to, or most people are going to their damnation. You know, they're in trouble. And we can imagine a modern version of that. Imagine violence, addiction, and war, loneliness, and anguish, and all those things that beset and bedevil our world. In this country, I'm sure you would imagine a lot of gun violence and school shooting and terrible things like that. God looks at that world, and what is his response? If you think about it, it should be a response of indignation. I created this world, and look what you're doing with it. But his response instead is to send the Son. It's the incarnation. So the incarnation is God's response to our pain, and our pain is a mixture of suffering that we've brought about for ourselves through our own sin, but it's also things that we have no control over. There's no real distinction made. And that's one of the big points about mercy, is it's not something, we tend to divide people into sinners and good people and bad people, but actually where God looks at us, he just sees the pain, whether it's the pain of sin or the pain of undeserved suffering. He responds in the same way. So the spiritual exercises, again, is crucial. And of course, as a young Jesuit, Jorge Mario Bergoglio studied St. Augustine. St. Augustine's great battle was with the Pelagians, and this very battle is what's described in Monday's document. Why were the Pelagians a heresy? Because they said they did have a view of grace. They said, sure, grace exists. God gives us a kind of a moral code to live by. You know, Jesus tells us how to live. But then we've got to get on with it, and it's up to us whether we do or we don't. When we go wrong, we can go and ask for confession, and we can be readmitted. But basically, we have everything we need to be saved. So there's no room in the Pelagian view for grace, for the daily, if you like, failure of which we all engage in. So we all fail. St. Augustine likened God, in fact, to a healer, to a doctor with a patient who's continually falling ill. It's very striking that Francis chose as his powerful metaphor for the church, battlefield hospital. This is a hospital where the bodies are lying in the field, twitching, covered in blood. And as he said in that great interview in 2013, in that situation, you don't go around checking people's levels of cholesterol. You tend to the wounds. You deal with the crisis at hand, what people really, really need. So the idea of the church, and he talks insistently, as the Latin American church does, about the Samaritan church. So the image of the Good Samaritan as an image for the church. The early church understood that parable of the Good Samaritan, that actually the Good Samaritan was Jesus, and that the church was like the inn where the Good Samaritan took the bleeding man to be healed. So this idea of the church as a hospital, as a place of healing, rather than of condemnation, is fundamental to this. And then also in his life, when he was asked in 2016 during the Jubilee of Mercy, why is this so important to you? Why is mercy matter so much? He talked about being the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, as he was from 1998 through to 2013. And he said it was listening to people's stories. This was a bishop who used to spend Saturdays in the slums, as you know, who used to take the bus, who spent a lot of time with people, listening to them, with their stories. And he says what always struck him was the effect of grace on their lives. In other words, God reaches people wherever they are, however they are. And he was continually amazed as a pastor at how even in the most chaotic life, the most apparently unchristian life, particularly of very poor people who often lead very chaotic lives, you could see by accompanying them how God was working in their life. The centrality of grace. He says he believes so much in mercy, the centrality of mercy in him, he told Tornielli, had evolved thanks to the many positive and beautiful stories that I've heard. It's experience that leads him to emphasize mercy. And you can see this sensitivity to the operation of grace from the very beginning in Evangelii Gaudium, the programmatic document of this papacy, where he says that discernment and evangelization means a new pastoral attentiveness to the workings of grace in concrete situations, to what he called God's saving love, which is mysteriously at work in each person, above and beyond their faults and failings. The Jesuit spiritual director and shepherd, who of course, as I said, has spent decades in these heart-to-heart meetings, spoke about how pastors need to accompany with mercy and patience the eventual stages of personal growth as these progressively occur. Imitating, that is, the divine pedagogy. That's how God treats us. He doesn't say, here's the truth, get on with it, and, I'll keep my arms crossed and wait for you to come to the finishing line, and I'll applaud you if you do, and if you mess up on the way, you can always come and say sorry, and sure, I'll read it. That's not how it works. In fact, we're struggling over the whole race course, and when we fall down, he's there. We progress by little steps, which is exactly, of course, what a good parent does with a child. It's how God operates in human lives that has so deeply marked Francis's understanding of mercy. And hence the rejection, the very strong rejection in him, the sometimes offensive rejection of the merciless moralizing of a certain kind of Catholic who says this is the truth and we need to keep defending the truth, and they do it in a kind of impatient, angry way, as if everybody would just understand this, we would all be saved. Once people get it, then it'll all be fine, and we need to keep banging on about it until they do. And the problem with that merciless moralizing is it is itself corrupted by neo-Pelagianism. It doesn't understand that that's not how people come to the truth. And that's why in Evangelii Gaudium he says, it's vital to recognize that a small step in the midst of great human limitations can be more pleasing to God than a life which appears outwardly in order but moves through the day without confronting great difficulties. In other words, it's easy to be moral if you're comfortable and middle class and all the rest of it. But actually, if you're a little bit pleased with yourself and you think you're doing well, you might be a lot less holy than the person down the road who is struggling in their weakness, but in all humility is turning to God and asking for divine help. And of course, that's always there. So that's so much in his life leads him to emphasize mercy. But in the second part, I want to talk about the broader, his understanding, his discernment, which is similar to that of the Latin American church, expressed above all in Aparecida, the great meeting in 2007, his discernment of why mercy is the necessary response to our times. If you've read Laudato Si', and I hope you have, you'll know that it refers to frequently a book by Romano Guardini called The End of the Modern World, written in 1950. And there's this word there that appears, which seems a little bit forbidding at first, called the technocratic paradigm, which is Guardini's term for what happens when technology, which is a great thing, I love my gadgets too, but when technology shapes our minds and our mindsets in such a way that we start to look at the world, if you like, through the paradigm, through the framework of whatever is quickest and most efficient and most effective, what creates the biggest impact. So this is the mentality that he sees in Laudato Si' behind global corporations ripping up rainforests for the sake of profit, but also, human trafficking, the way we treat each other as ends as means rather than ends, the way we treat each other as mere cogs in a machine and dispensable. He has this great phrase, the throwaway culture, when we reduce each other to commodities. So Bergoglio Francis looks at the world and he sees, very much influenced by Romano Guardini's language, of a world which is increasingly dominated by this technocratic paradigm. Now, one thing I always say about Francis is one of the ways you know he's not a liberal is he actually has very little confidence in modernity. He has a very bleak view, I think a very similar view in many ways to Benedict's and John Paul II's, but he has rather a bleak view of the way the modern world is going. Whenever he talks about this, it's always in quite bleak terms. So I'll just, a couple of examples. Brazilian bishops back in July 2013, he talked about the darker side of globalization, the loss of a sense of life's meaning, personal dissolution, the loss of experience of belonging to a nest, subtle but relentless violence, the inner fragmentation, the breakup of families. It's a pretty startling list of things. Loneliness, abandonment, the inability to love, to forgive, to understand, addiction. He sees the breakup of the things which make us human. The bonds of belonging are being corroded by this dissolution, by this liquidity. This is how he talks. In the preparatory document for the Synod on Young People, which will be happening in October, he says, sadness and loneliness appear to be on the rise, not least among young people. And he talks about the throwaway culture, which excludes millions of people, including many young people, and leads to the indiscriminate exploitation of natural resources and environmental degradation. So, in Laudato Si', he asks us to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. But that chapter 1 of Laudato Si' presents a very bleak picture of what happens when humanity is enthralled to the technocratic paradigm. I won't bang on about this. I hope you got the point. His view, and as I say, it's not I don't think actually it's that unusual. It's a view I think that's shared by many church leaders who look out on globalization. They see many positive things, but they see this dark side as well. So hence also his emphasis and concern with migration, because migration, the phenomenon of our time is liquidity, is uprooting. So it becomes harder and harder to relate to physical spaces and communities. And of course, it makes it harder to be spiritual in the sense that our connectedness to the institutions which give us meaning are also increasingly under threat. So the response to the experience of this loss, and it is an experience, the anguish of loss, he believes, is not an idea. It's not an ideology. It's not, in other words, a particular truth. The response to this is actually another experience, not an idea. And he said often, as Archbishop, the world is sick of words. We're sick of hearing about words and ideas. What we need is experience, the experience of perceiving the anguish of the other and responding to that. We need to belong. It is the anguish, the experience of belonging. And the heart of the gospel is in a sense, to create that environment of welcome, that hospitality which I spoke of at the beginning, one that incarnates God's welcome and dignifies human beings. Now, in Aparecida, 2007, the whole Latin American church, 23 bishops' conferences, got together for the first time since 1992, and they did this very profound light and shadows discernment of our time. And they said, here's what they said: the church is called to a deep and profound rethinking of its mission. What is required is confirming, renewing, and revitalizing the newness of the gospel rooted in our history, out of a personal and community encounter with Jesus Christ that raises up disciples and missionaries. Now, this is key because in the view of from Latin America, they looked at the world and they saw actually that things that held together Christianity in the past, law, institutions, the support of the state, were all being swept away. And that unless people had that encounter with Christ, that personal experience of religion, of spirituality of Christ, then it wouldn't be enough. When he was talking to the catechists in Buenos Aires after Aparecida, Bergoglio said, a Catholic faith reduced to a mere baggage, to a collection of rules and prohibitions, to fragmented devotional practices, to partial adherence to the truths of the faith, blah, 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 bland and nervous moralizing, that does not convert the life of the baptized, will not withstand the trials of time. So his view is all this is being swept away, again, foreseen by Guardini, that there would be this gradual increasing breakup. We talk about secularization and individualism and relativism and liquidity and so on. It's all happening around us. We know it is. But Guardini foresaw that increasingly there would be a kind of rivalry between this technocratic, individualized, globalized world and a humble Christianity that's humble because it's no longer attached to the things that are being swept away, the laws, the regulations, the state, and so on. Now, one can argue this and say it was just a thesis, but I've done a little bit of digging for my second book, which I'm just working on now on the papacy, and I'm very struck by how the Latin Americans, far more than anywhere else in the world, were doing a very profound discernment about the signs of the times in a way that was not going on in Europe or in the United States. And a very key man in all of this, by the way, is the one who Francis has just named as Archbishop of Mexico, Carlos Aguiarretes, who published a very important document in 2012 called Globalization and the New Evangelization. And here he talks, and you can see how this underpins Aparecida, that he talks there about the need for a recasting of the pastoral action of the church, that we've been for centuries geared, the idea that the church offers essentially a knowledge, a doctrine, a thing that you learn, and that somehow saves you. That's no longer going to be enough. Now we have to be worried about discovering God, this God of mercy who opens the doors to you, this God of mercy that you have to communicate. So the church's preoccupation in this view, the church has been too preoccupied with the defense of the truth in terms of an idea, or the truth in law and in the state. In other words, with defending and upholding a Christian view in culture and the state. While in fact all this has been going on down below, things have been dissolving. People have actually lost the capacity to have that encounter with Christ down below. This is the shift of emphasis of this pontificate, which is actually quite hard to articulate, but it's a shift of focus. It doesn't mean that doctrine and truth matter any less, far from it, but it's about helping people to live that truth rather than simply talking about it. In their analysis, they were very struck, the Latin Americans, and I'm particularly struck when I look at Bergoglio's writings, about how faced with liquidity, there is a kind of a false consolation, if you like, there's a trapdoor, a temptation, which is faced with liquidity. People want, obviously, certainty. They want to belong. But the temptation becomes that we then fix our certainty on an idea or a particular moment in the past or a particular kind of liturgy or a particular... Right? They saw, looking at, there was a rise in the church and in all religion of fundamentalism, of traditionalism, of rigorism, of a kind of obsession with rules and intransigence, which they saw as a sign of a false consolation, because in fact the real rootedness that we seek is in Jesus Christ, because this was actually not putting Christ at the center. Now, I'm convinced that Benedict saw exactly the same thing going on. So much of what he said and wrote points to this. And the key quote is from 2005, Deus Caritas Est, when he said, "Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction." Now, this is repeated, this quote, in the Aparecida document. And if you look, you'll find it in Evangelii Gaudium, where Pope Francis says he never tires of repeating it. He never tires of repeating it. Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event and a person that gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. The encounter is the encounter with Christ. The experience is the experience of God's mercy. If people do not have that encounter and they do not have that experience, then they are not converted. That will be insufficient, if you like, for the church of the future. If you can't offer that, then we're in trouble. So I hope I'm not making this too opaque. You have a situation of liquidity. You have the false consolation or temptation of fundamentalism and rigidity, Gnosticism and Pelagianism, to give it big words that Francis gives them on Monday. In other words, a reliance increasingly on methods, on rules, on doctrines, on liturgies, as if this will save us. And these are all, by the way, good things. Liturgy is a good thing, it's a wonderful thing, doctrine is a wonderful thing. The problem is if you believe that by having those things you can somehow save yourself, rather than being confident in the grace of Jesus Christ. This is the heart of the issue. So he's warned constantly in his pontificate about the dangers of Gnosticism and of Pelagianism, either of vague intellectualism, abstraction, the idea of sort of Catholicism as a set of ideas that's rather distant from human reality, or on the other hand, this sort of slightly mechanistic outlook where if we have all the right programs and we do this and we do that, then somehow we save ourselves. He sees in both Gnosticism and Pelagianism a fleeing from the incarnation. God saves us by becoming incarnate in this time and in this place, by taking on flesh here and now concretely. And that's why Francis keeps talking about the church needing to be close and concrete. When I first heard him talk about it, I said, what does he mean by this? Concretezza e vicinanza in Italian, the two words he keeps talking about. And then I realized, now you read the document on Monday, you see what he's getting at. Because God saves us through an encounter, through proximity, through closeness, through concreteness, not through abstraction. This is absolutely the heart of it. There's a wonderful book coming out in a short time by Massimo Borghese, an Italian philosopher. It's a great book. I've written about it for Crux. It's just called An Intellectual Biography of Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Look out for it, because he goes into this in great detail, that what he calls the ethicist deviation of the church, which is really what the Francis papacy is trying to avoid or oppose. The ethicist deviation, right? The idea that in response to liquidity and relativism, we have to be ultra certain, we have to be very fixed. And he describes this as a strategy for resistance, not renaissance. So the objective of the Latin American church in Aparecida was, how do we evangelize the modern world? Not how do we defend ourselves from the threat from it, but how do we create a culture that is influenced by the gospel? And how to move from desolation to consolation. In 2002, 12, there was a synod called by Pope Benedict on the new evangelization. Basically, the question was, how do we repropose the gospel to the modern world, particularly to countries which are no longer Christian but have a Christian culture? And it was fascinating. I make quite a big bit of this in The Great Reformer, and I want to make even more of it in the next book. But you can see in the synod that there's this kind of these two things going on. I mean, obviously, there are more than two. But on the one hand, you've got this, what we might call the ethicist deviation. You've got these often very conservative European cardinals standing up, giving long denunciations of relativism and secularism and talking about the church as if it's persecuted and we're now a minority and the law and the same-sex marriage and all that. And really a kind of turning in on the church turned in on itself, very afraid, very angry, very indignant at the sense of loss of something. And then you get this other voice which is coming from the south, from Latin America, which cares passionately about the truth of the gospel, but it's much more joyful, much more pastoral, much more about accompaniment, and asks itself, how do we need to change in order to evangelize the world? Not how does the world need to change. In other words, not blaming the culture for the church's failure to evangelize, but how the church can better evangelize the world. So all this is the fruit, I think, of all this thinking is what goes into the papacy. I just want to mention one other thing before I move on to the papacy. And that's a talk that the then Archbishop of Buenos Aires gave in 2004, which is really interesting in the light of the attacks on Pope Francis from certain quarters, specifically the four cardinals who signed a dubia letter, where they use Veritatis Splendor, Pope John Paul II's document on truth of 1994. They use that document against Francis to say that he somehow cares less about objective truth than John Paul II. And it's interesting because there's a talk that Bergoglio gave in 2004, which is a passionate talk in favor of this very encyclical, Veritatis Splendor, in which he praises its firm stance against a de-Christianized culture conditioned by subjectivism and relativism and so on. But interestingly, the talk is called, in the light of the document on Monday, it's called It's Possible to Be Saints, Es Posible Ser Santos. And it focuses on a part of Veritatis Splendor which Francis's critics never talk about, which is the centrality of grace in living the love to which and the truth to which Christ calls us. And in his talk, Bergoglio quotes Veritatis that living that love, living that truth, is impossible by our own power and our ability, and only feasible by virtue of a gift received. That's to say, God's love and assistance, sacraments, prayer, and so on, grace. And Bergoglio quotes John Paul II, who quotes St. Augustine, that it wasn't keeping the commandments that brings about love, but the other way round. Who can doubt that love comes first? For the one who does not love has no reason for keeping the commandments. For this reason, explained John Paul II, gospel morality was not firstly a precept or a command, but the fruit of God's gift of grace to which we respond. Now, I quote this, and I mention this, because Bergoglio is saying, I love Veritatis Splendor. I think John Paul II is doing a wonderful thing here, reaffirming the glory and the objectivity of truth and doctrine. This is wonderful. But then he's also quoting the bit about grace. And he goes on to say this, Bergoglio does. He's reflecting on this. He says, perhaps it is because Christian morality is so often proposed as a lofty precept, as a kind of command, especially in Western nations. Perhaps it's because of that contemporary humanity has succumbed to the grave temptation against which John Paul II warned, namely that man himself becomes the measure of what is good or bad. It's an interesting point. Relativism, in other words, is the flip side of the moral authoritarianism of a Christianity presented as a moral code, rather than as a journey to the truth which God assists us in traveling. So I think this is a great irony, that he was attacked using Veritatis Splendor, because in fact, I think you can see in this talk the germ of what becomes Amoris Laetitia 12 years later, which is, what is the ambition of Amoris? It's to broaden and unblock the people's access to grace, which the church offers. In other words, it was precisely to allow people better to live the absolute moral norms defended by Veritatis. And the theology of grace on which Amoris relies, particularly Archbishop Victor Fernandez's He's got a paper in 2011 on precisely the operation of grace in the lives of often very poor people who live very chaotic lives. It's precisely this that is all about how do we live the truth. In other words, how do we better enable the grace, which after all, let's face it, Jesus Christ has entrusted to the church to offer humanity. How do we better unblock and allow access to that grace? I think here we're getting into the heart of the ambition of the Francis pontificate. 2007, he gave an interview. He said, "In a world we do not manage to interest with our words, only the presence of God who loves and saves us will catch people's attention," adding, we shouldn't be afraid to depend solely on the tenderness of God. We shouldn't be afraid solely to rely on the tenderness of God. We evangelize by offering the mercy, the tenderness of God, not by other ways. It's a very thought-provoking remark. So in other words, when the church offers its truth without offering at the same time grace, without emphasizing the centrality of grace, it actually has the opposite effect of what the church is seeking to do. Rather than convince people, it intimidates them. Rather than winning them over, it threatens them. Bergoglio gave a retreat in November 2012, just a few months before he was elected Pope. And he said, truth is like a precious stone. When you offer it in your hand, it seduces people. But when you throw it in their faces, it wounds them. Same stone, different effect. Same truth, different effect. Truth without mercy is not Christianity. This is the consistent message. He also said in that same retreat, he talked about the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. You know, the famous story, woman's caught in adultery, there's a group of people wanting to stone her as the law demands. Jesus steps in, prevents them from stoning her, says, "He who is without sin, let the cast the first stone." The crowd disappears. He's alone with the woman. He says to her, "Has anybody condemned you? No, nor do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." He's talking about this, as he often has done, he often does. And he says, do you think that woman returned to her life of adultery, a life of promiscuity? He says, you don't know. The gospel doesn't tell us. But then he says, you can be sure that she didn't, because whoever encounters such great mercy cannot depart from the law. El que se encuentre con una misericordia tan grande no puede desviarse de la ley. It's really strong. I don't think as Pope he'd be allowed to say it, but I think it's what he believes. If you really, it is mercy that converts us. It is mercy that makes us moral. It is the experience of God's love, which then shows us the value of being, of truth and morality and everything else. So I hope I've got that. I hope I've got that point. Let's just now end with a few ideas from his papacy. As you know, in 2016, he called a Jubilee of Mercy. This is an absolutely key moment in the papacy, a key moment to bring about the pastoral conversion that he's seeking in the church. A church, in other words, that's less distant and abstract and focused on the defense of the law, but rather a church capable of coming close to people, accompanying them in their lives and helping them to reach that place. And he spoke in very strong terms, and I think this gives it away. Without a church capable of rediscovering the maternal womb of mercy, he told the Brazilian bishops actually in Rio, we have little chance nowadays of becoming part of a world of wounded persons. But sorry, well, the quote I was going to give you was actually from the Misericordia Vultus, the Face of Mercy, the document with which he opened the Jubilee, where he says, unless people see God's merciful love in the church, they will fail to recognize God's body on earth. That's pretty strong. And then he says, perhaps we have long forgotten how to show and live the way of mercy. It's very strong. He's saying the church has forgotten, or risks forgetting, or has sometimes at least forgotten how to live that mercy. And that's why we're not evangelizing. There's, of course, an essential continuity here, because John Paul II and Benedict both spoke very, very much about mercy. One could argue, like Casper does in his book, that it's part of a reawakening of the modern times. But nonetheless, in Francis, you get this special emphasis, this boldness, this creativeness, this urgency in the proclamation that is really quite new. There's a book out recently called Pope Francis Lexicon, to which I also contributed. And there, the Canadian Archbishop Donald Boland says that one gets the sense with Francis that without it, that's to say mercy, he would be stumbling for words. And at the same time, he loads it with a meaning as vast and as comprehensive as God's relationship with humanity. And I think that just about sums up Francis and mercy. That's how important it is. Now, what's interesting about the Jubilee of Mercy is the way he talked about sin, mercy as a response to sin. And here's where it gets difficult for many people. He takes a great sin, and in fact, he took the example of abortion. What was his response to abortion was to an indult, to make it clear that forgiveness was available to any person, not just a woman who had had an abortion, but anybody complicit in an abortion. The confessional is there, the priest is waiting, all you have to do is come. Now, I won't go into why this was necessary to say, it's to do with the complexity of canon law and so on, but the message that he wanted to give the world is come and be forgiven. And he kept talking about the sin and the violence and the suffering in the world, to which the response has to be an ocean of mercy. This is how God responds to the sin and suffering, is with mercy. Now, it's challenging for a lot of people, because when you feel threatened by something, sin, error, whatever it is, your reaction is to double down and reinforce what it is that you value. Mercy isn't often the first thing that comes to us, which is why we need and that's true of the church as well, which is why we need a pastoral conversion. In the early church, Christianity spread like wildfire in the early centuries because of its emphasis on mercy. Pagan people were deeply amazed and scandalized by Christian mercy. They believed in gods that at best you could negotiate with, but they were distant and cold. You looked after your family, your tribe, whereas these Christians seemed to be wanting to take care of poor people who they weren't even related to, because they had had an experience of God's mercy. They had lived through the heart of our faith, which we've just lived through in Easter, and they wanted to spread that. And that's what led to the spreading of the church so far. So why is it in a culture where we are in many ways reverting to paganism? If you see many of the parallels between the early centuries of the church and now, they're quite striking. Why isn't it that the church isn't spreading like wildfire? And I think Francis asked himself that question, and he says, because we're not being merciful. We don't yet have the fire of mercy. We don't have enough of the fire of mercy that first raged in the early church. So I want to end by going back to that three-part process, that dynamic which he experienced in the Basilica in Flores in 1953. Sensing need, the Jubilee of Mercy was full of the Pope with people who were suffering. And I don't need to give you examples. You must have seen so many of them. The embraces, the encounters, which have deeply moved people and deeply moved people well outside the church. So the first thing that the Pope has shown us is that we have to become aware of and sense anguish and need and reach out to it. Secondly, we have to respond concretely. He kept emphasizing mercy is not an idea, it is an action. Jim Keenan, the Jesuit down the road at Boston College, has a beautiful definition of mercy as the willingness to enter into the chaos of another. It's a wonderful definition. Basically, that's what God does in response to our suffering. He doesn't hang out outside, he comes in with us. So the works of mercy, we save others, we save the world through the works of mercy. There are corporal and, of course, spiritual mercy. And his own actions in Rome, through his own papal almoner with the homeless and so on, was a constant demonstration of that. Okay, those two bits we get. The third part is to integrate and to save. And here's where it's been more challenging for people. He sent a rosary to a woman in Argentina called Milagros Sala, who's an activist, a social activist in Jujuy, and very controversial woman, and she's in jail for embezzlement and all sorts of things, or accused of embezzlement. Francis sent her a rosary. She wrote him a letter. He said, became this huge scandal in Argentina. You know, is the Pope supporting this woman? I'll give you another example. Diego Neria, a transgendered Spanish man, wrote to the Pope and talked about the suffering in his own parish following his gender reassignment operation. The Pope said, come and see me, bring your wife, because he'd had the gender anyway. He then spoke about her on the plane and talked about he who was a she and talked about his own suffering and his response. And the reaction of many Catholics was, well, the Pope appears to be endorsing gender reassignment and transgenderism. And yet, just a couple of weeks later, he thundered against gender ideology and ideological colonization. See, there is no contradiction between embracing and integrating the outsider and defending the value that you're upholding. The two are not in contradiction. And yet, throughout this papacy, that has been the problem. The controversies have raged around precisely this question of integration, and most strongly, of course, over Amoris Laetitia and the question of the integration of the divorced and remarried into the life of the church. But when I've gone into this for this new book and I've studied everything that Francis said during the synods, he kept saying it's not a question of yes or no. It's not a question of allowing people the sacraments or not. We have to integrate, we have to come alongside them, we have to know them, we have to understand them, we have to see where grace is operating in their lives. Only then can we make judgments about sacraments and indeed anything else. But how hard it's been for him to say that this is how the church needs to be. On both sides, right and left, he's been criticized. But I want to argue that at the heart of what he's trying to do is to instill this threefold dynamic in the heart of the church, which is how God operates with us. It's how the God of mercy saves us, sensing need, traveling with us, accompanying, discerning, and integrating, saving us through integration. Mercy always saves. That is the purpose of it. So, gaudete et exultate. It couldn't be clearer on Monday. Rejoice and be glad. There is no holiness without mercy. Holiness is taking on the pattern of Jesus evermore, and Jesus is mercy. And the good news is that in wanting that, all we have to do is want that. And sure, our lives have to change and we have to change our behavior, but it's always in response to that invitation. And that we need, our task is humility. Our task is to learn how to ask, to depend on God's grace rather than our own means. Mercy, he says in that document, is the very foundation of the church's life. And in this regard, he says, I would like to reiterate, mercy does not exclude justice and truth. Indeed, we have to say mercy is the fullness of justice and the most radiant manifestation of God's truth. By emphasizing mercy, we don't dilute truth. By emphasizing truth at the expense of mercy, we dilute the truth about God. That's the big paradox at the heart of this papacy. I mentioned that the church in the early centuries, how quickly it spread because of it embodied mercy. Francis puts this very simply in Misericordia Vultus. He says it's a life and death question for the church's future. It is absolutely essential for the church and for the credibility of her message that she herself live and testify to mercy. Wherever there are Christians, he said, everyone should find an oasis of mercy. And that, my friends, is Francis's plan for the church, his ambition for the church, his vision for the church, his reform of the church centers on that key idea. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks again very much. There were a number of things, as you were speaking, and so I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Mary Roach. I'm from the Religious Studies Department. I teach ethics here at the college. And when I heard about your lecture and the topic of your talk, and as I've been living with and trying to experience and understand the papacy, the Jubilee Year of Mercy, in my own development as an ethicist, my first mentor in that is James Keenan. And so I, of course, had been reading about mercy and this definition of mercy, entering into the chaos of the life of another in order to help them in their need. And I, of course, was thinking that the Pope had picked up on that in the Jubilee Year of Mercy. And I also find that definition really compelling. I find it really compelling. And there are a couple of things, I guess, that really strike me, and maybe I'll just mention them to kind of lead us into the discussion, because as I look out, I see a lot of people. I see some people who taught me, and I know they're going to bring some really rich questions and comments. One thing I think for me, thinking about mercy and thinking about this definition of entering into the chaos of the life of another, and this wonderful image that the Pope has used and you have recalled for us of God making the first move, right? And how we think about mercy and try to really temper, I think, what is a sort of a more common use of the word, really associating it with forgiveness and offering forgiveness, which is important, surely, and the sense in which perhaps we don't want a God who is just, we want one who is merciful, right, who will give us something in the end that we have not deserved or earned in any way. But I think when we hang on to that, right, some of the dynamic about entering into the chaos of the lives of other people as if to forgive them for their chaos, right, I think is problematic, and I think is something that's worth talking about. I think it also, there are sort of other elements thinking about justice and mercy together, also that as I enter into the chaos of the life of another, I have to be really aware of the ways in which I am complicit in the chaos of their lives, right? And so not holding on to a dynamic where I am evangelizing, right? There is a sense in which having the experience of Christ, Jesus, God, who has entered the chaos, the anguish, the perplexity of my own life and the life of people that I love, but also really keenly aware that sometimes the first move is really from the person who is living in that chaotic moment, right? That really, that may be the first move, right? Being in proximity with folks as we've had a speaker here not too long ago talking about proximity and proximity particularly with people who are living on death row. But it really, the sense in which that in some ways this movement into proximity may be my response to my own sort of personal experience and conversion, but that also that God is moving in the people with whom I sort of associate chaos, and often too easily associate that chaos with some sort of personal moral failing, right? And so those are some of the things that I think about as you were talking. When I was a student here, I heard something that really changed my life and my whole outlook, and I recall it every time, and you mentioned the Pope referring to the woman caught in adultery, and referring to that image, other images like the Good Samaritan. But I was at, I don't know if it was a homily or a lecture or something when I was a student here 30 years ago, and someone asked the question, what difference would it make if we stopped calling that the woman caught in adultery and called it for the story that it is, the woman who is saved from stoning? And how, if we change our language about that, what does that mean for us in terms of mercy? What does that mean for us in terms of who's saving who, which I see a lot on Rescue Dog Family, like who's saving who, but really kind of getting into this sense, a more dynamic and mutual, I guess, relationship of mercy and that sort of ongoing experience as I enter into the chaos in the life of another. I'd also just really quickly, in closing, because you had mentioned Jim, and that was sort of part of my planned response, is a couple of days ago, I was with a group of faculty who were discussing another book of his, later than his books on mercy and his other books on moral theology, which all of my students read every semester, on university ethics. And I'm also really kind of intrigued in these days about what the place of mercy and entering into chaos and the life of the university and the life of the church, and thinking about some of the people that we have thrown away, and not simply talk about people who have been thrown away by technology, but to be attentive to when our communities and even our churches have thrown people away. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing more about the conversation, and you want me to come over here.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both. I'm sure there's some great questions in the audience. Matthew?
Cardinal Schönborn of Vienna said that the Pope told him that when he was speaking about some of the opposition to the Pope on this, that Francis said, we must win over this church opposition with love, something like that. And I think that is actually what he's trying to do. A lot of people are saying, well, why doesn't he engage in a dialogue with the Dubier cardinals? Well, the answer is because they don't want a dialogue. The point about the Dubier is it's a campaign device to inflame public opinion, to alert them that that this Pope has fallen into heresy. And the way the questions are framed, they're not really questions at all, they're accusations of a heresy. Now, the cardinals themselves can go and, they're free to express themselves. But in the whole kind of dynamics of this thing, I mean, a dialogue assumes two people who wish to enter into dialogue in a common search for the truth. And I really don't think that's what those cardinals are seeking to do. They're seeking to demonstrate a particular point of view. But he has responded to them in countless ways, in homilies, I think the best response to the Dubier was on Monday. He is directly responding to those very accusations in Warrior, but he's chosen not to do so directly in the form of, some letter in response to them, because that would be to engage in a dynamic which actually would trap the Pope, that is seeking to trap the Pope in exactly what he's trying to show that we shouldn't be trapped in, right? Which is this legalistic dynamic, which is either yes or no. No, but that's my point. He's not. He is continually entering. I mean, I think actually his many responses to the Dubier, his many references to legalism, to the doctrine of the law. Look, I think of the great homily to the cardinals, which I was going to mention in February 2015, where he said there were two ways of thinking in the church. One is how do we protect the saved, and how do we save the lost? Right? There's these two dynamics. I think that, again, that was a response to precisely the legalistic mentality. So I think he's entering into it pastorally, by dealing with the mindset that underpins the objections. I think he's responding to it in countless ways as a pastor and as a teacher. Well, first of all, I disagree with you very strongly that he has been dismissing people in Rome. The complaint of people who support him, who are close to him, is how on earth does he put up with some of the tremendous opposition he's had from within the Curia? Why does he leave in place people like, Cardinal Muller, Cardinal Sarah, who regularly defies him, and so on? Well, Muller, as you know, he did remove, but only at the end of his 5-year term. And after 2 years of Muller really saying things that showed he disagreed with the Pope on all kinds of things. So I'm just curious, what other examples would you give of dismissals? Oh, I see. Well, gosh, boy, there had to be a big turnover at the bank to turn it into a respectable institution. My colleagues here actually probably know more details about who, but I mean, the bank has undergone a number of personnel changes. But when you hear recently that 2 of the directors back in 2013 are now being, facing charges of embezzlement of some serious money, I think you'll agree that a few heads had to roll there. But I don't think actually the Pope's had too much to do with the IOR, actually. But no, most of what's happening in Rome, in terms of the Curia, is actually a very slow process, which he's entrusted to the C9 cardinals. And I understand that this year, Rodriguez de Maradiaga has said there will probably be a new constitution, either this year or early next year. But actually, it's been a very slow process, and it's been very slow because, as the Pope himself says, he doesn't like to cut off heads. He's not interested in simply changing all the personnel. What he wants is to change the culture, and then for there to be a redesign of the Curia to reflect the new mentality, and then you'll find the right people. I think he's doing it. I think the idea of that is quite clever. When the next conclave happens, he wants the cardinals to get together to say not how do we continue Francis's reforms, but how do we continue our reforms. In a way, how do you gauge the? I mean, you can gauge the success of a pontificate, as with any form of governance, by saying he has these objectives. Let's see whether he's achieved them. And we could now go through a list of those things, which I think. But actually, at the heart of what he's trying to do is what I was trying to describe. And you're right; it is eliciting an opposition, a furious opposition, which in a way is showing that the church is divided, right? So one might argue, well, he hasn't succeeded in uniting the church. But then you think back on 2,000 years ago, and what happened is that Jesus united the people, and in the process elicited a furious opposition from certain elites, which I think is exactly what's happening. So in that sense, the shadow of the cross falls across this papacy, is a sign of his fidelity to the gospel, which is, right? We're getting into theological territory here. What is success and failure in terms of the gospel? But yeah, I mean, I think surely it is. I would say, if by the end of this pontificate, or even now 5 years in, is the church more pastorally converted? Do people look at the church and see the gospel rather than simply a moral code or an institution seeking to impose itself? See, I can go out there and I can ask people on the streets of Worcester, or as I've been taught to call it, Worcester, and I can say, what do you think of the Catholic Church? And you will get a lot of words like dogmatic, doctrinaire, authoritarian, seeking to impose itself, Now, why? If the gospel is a gospel of mercy, do people perceive that? And I think that's the shift that he's trying to bring about. Now, we're in media res. It's only 5 years. Change takes a long time in the church and indeed elsewhere. I would say after 5 years, yes, the perception of the church is considerably different from the one it was back in 2013. And I have a huge love and respect for Benedict, and I don't think the church under him was in any way what people thought it was. But nonetheless, I think the perception has changed, and I think therefore he can point to some success. Well, we all get asked this regularly. I was once, I think because he did say, was it Korea, colleagues, where he talked about a short papacy? Was it on the flight? Anyway, it was an early flight where he said, I have this intuition that this is going to be a short papacy. And the idea of 5 years, did he say 5 years? Anyway, somebody said 5 years. 4 to 5 years, sorry. The Pope said, 4 to 5 years, you see.
One of the interviews did earlier in his pontificate.
Yeah, it was in an interview he said it. I just sort of, I've had this kind of intuition. So, of course, ever since then, people are like, well, your 5 years is up, what's he doing? Some people, yeah. I think from people who are close to Francis, I understand that he had or has a 5-year plan. And in that sense, he's being a good Jesuit, Father Jim, wouldn't you say, right? I mean, no provincial takes over without a 5-year plan. And I think, and then I heard recently that he realizes he needs 7 years to carry out his 5-year plan because of the resistances and so on. So, look at his age. I don't see a man slowing down. He's got tremendous energy. He's got tremendous fire. But I think it would not be unrealistic to say that over the next couple of years, and this obviously is sadly subject to Benedict's dying. I don't think he could stand down before then. But I think after Benedict's funeral, whenever that sad day comes, I think he would begin to be discerning the moment in which he might want to step down, simply because of his age and because of his... but whether that's, 2020, 2022, I don't know. What I do know is that he will consider resigning because, as he said a number of times, Benedict has changed the papacy by resigning. In other words, every pope from now on will need to discern whether they have the physical strength to carry on, given the demands of the papal role nowadays.
Any last word either of you want to leave us with?
Ooh.
Oh, no, I give you.
Oh, the last word. Well, just to say, I don't know whether most of you know, but we had a busy afternoon because the Pope has written a letter to Chile that was read out by the Chilean bishops, humbly apologizing for his serious errors of misjudgment over the Chile abuse cases involving, although he didn't mention him, Bishop Barros. And he's asked the Chilean bishops to come to Rome, all 32 of them.
Ask is a nice word.
Yes, he summoned them to Rome to consider the ways forward. I think it's a great note to end on. Here is a pope who one might say, he was right to say that no person should ever be punished when they say they are innocent and there isn't sufficient evidence. But on the other hand, the evidence has come in and is clearly pointing in a different direction. The Pope says, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Now what are we going to do about it? I think that's a demonstration of just the kind of humility that I think he's calling on the church to embrace. And I think we can all learn from that. And I, who was vigorously defending him on Chilean television, actually, I realize I probably went too far in some of my defenses. We all have to have that capacity to say we got it wrong. And that's part of what makes us adult and enables us to grow in holiness and indeed in other things. So thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you. Thank you.